the murder of JFK, John F. Kennedy, President John F. Kennedy, back in 1963. 60th anniversary it is this week. So that murder's been on my mind. And I've been thinking particularly about one of many things that he said, one of many quotes. Now, on the 20th of January 1961, at his inaugural address to the nation of the United States of America, he urged those listening to ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Now, it's a fine sentiment, you might say, and it's been immortalised. It's inspirational advice, certainly for a nation like the United States of America in 1961, which was, in the scheme of things, still a young nation. But having said as much to his fellow Americans, he then turned his attention to the international audience that he knew was watching as well. And he delivered a second half to that thought that's less familiar probably, and it's certainly quoted less often. It was a time of Cold War and the threat of nuclear Armageddon, duck and cover and all that. And he spoke accordingly. He said, "My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man." And I have to say, God love him, but those words sound deeply ironic now. John F. Kennedy knew about the deep state, and he may well have hoped to challenge it, to do something about, amongst other things, the endless appetite of the already well-established by then military-industrial complex, its appetite for, perpetual war and all of war's attendant riches for the few who keep themselves safely out of harm's way, while other mothers' sons are being blown to smithereens in far-off lands. But whatever his aspirations were in 1961, less than 3 years later, he was dead, murdered by conspirators who wanted rid of a US president who was reluctant to commit his nation to war in Vietnam, or pretty much war anywhere else. So I've been thinking about his words this week, and for all sorts of reasons. For one thing, the freedom of man that he floated as an aspiration seems desperately endangered now, certainly in the West. Giant corporations, transnational corporations indeed, in league with politicians, having bought and paid for politicians, in league with central banks, are manoeuvring to erase or restrict the freedom of men and women and children wherever they can. Klaus Schwab and his little wizards of the World Economic Forum, and others like them, say in whatever computer salesman Bill Gates' World Health Organization, in NATO, in the Bank for International Settlements, sitting there with its diplomatic immunity in Geneva, or wherever it is it sits in Switzerland. All of them are drawing together as so-called stakeholder capitalists, but it's fascism by any other name. Instead of any freedom for humankind, they have it in mind to re-establish feudalism, I would say. A terrifyingly small, terrifyingly thin upper stratum of obscenely wealthy and powerful, and everybody else scrabbling underneath them for whatever crumbs fall from the table. Until they get to the point that almost all of us have nothing, and they'll have everything. So, you can see the mood I'm in. But on a lighter note, and God knows we need some light notes now, I've been thinking about JFK's other line as well, the one about asking not what your country can do for you, but asking what you can do for your country instead. What a hoot that is now. What a laugh. In all seriousness, I would say we need to update dear old JFK's sentiments and ask not what we can do for our countries. Rather, I would say we should demand that our countries, at least in the form of our country's governments and their corporate puppet masters, get their bloated carcasses out of our faces and let us get on with our lives. We don't need them and we don't want them, or we shouldn't. I say that's what our countries can do for us, folks, fellow time travellers. They can leave us, the people, alone. Frankly, before they finally push their luck too far. I've mentioned corporations, and it's worth pausing and considering what the word corporation even means. It derives from corpus, which is the Latin for a body. A corporation is what they call those unholy Frankenstein's monsters in the US. In the UK, technically the same thing, the same entities are called limited liability companies. And the idea for such is centuries old now. Someone somewhere realised it was much too risky to be a businessman or a tradesman or whatever who was legally and financially liable for any failure on the part of any service he offered or any product he provided. And, if you were a boat builder, for example, and something went wrong with one of the boats you'd built, maybe it fell apart and sank, the person you'd sold it to could come after you personally for compensation. And a person might be ruined, sent to jail even, if not worse. But, and here's where the genius came in, if you set up a limited liability company, if you conjure into being the very idea of limited liability companies, you have some legal types, you have some lawyers draw up paperwork to that effect, and presto, as if by magic, if something goes wrong, it's the company that's liable, not the owners of the company. It's a get out of jail free card, if you will. Oh, your boat sank, did it? Oh, well, that's not my problem. You take it up with the company. I'll be over here in my chateau. And a corporation is exactly the same. That's the American equivalent. As if by magic, the law recognises and deals with the corporation as though it was a flesh and blood person. The one thing the corporation does not have, i.e. a corpus, a body, is granted to it by the law alone. It's a legal fiction. That's what you call it, a legal fiction. And give the devil his due, corporations can bring people together. Thousands, tens of thousands of people can be brought together to set themselves to accomplishing tasks that would be utterly beyond any of them alone. And people come together under the umbrella of a corporation, or they used to, let me stress, used to at least, in a spirit of cooperation and shared benefit. Once upon a time, a corporation meant there was something in it for employees and customers alike. That was the deal. But in this world of monstrous, bloated, transnational corporations, BlackRock, Vanguard and the like, something has changed, and profoundly for the worse. Increasingly, corporations exist to exploit populations. Worse yet, they seem, to all intents and purposes, to exist to treat populations, their customers, with undisguised contempt. Now, instead of just making stuff that we want, corporations, infected by the sickness of ESG and inclusivity and diversity and equity and the rest of the corrupting bollocks of woke. And don't forget, it's woke that they don't even believe in. They just cynically employ the nonsense of woke to gain control. They have the temerity to tell us how to be, what to do, how to live our lives. Imagine corporations that once existed just to make things now dictate our behaviour, or they try to. I first noticed it back in 2019 or so, I think. It was 2019, with that Gillette advert. A company that supposedly exists to make we throwaway plastic razors. Well, you remember the advertising campaign that declared that men were just innately bad, that masculinity was toxic, and that men and boys would only and always bully and abuse their way to the top or to get what they wanted because they were born that way. Masculinity is toxic. There you go. Remember that. It was a disaster for Gillette, and rightly so. They wiped whatever billions off their value. But the truth is, the tragedy is that resultant in financial failure or not, that lecturing, patronising tone in advertising and from any entity that claims or just assumes the right to dictate our behaviour now permeates every walk of life. Now we're lectured around the clock in every conceivable way. We're told that we're just bad news, damaged goods, that we're a plague on life on earth, that must be corrected, or else. Corporations do it, and so do our governments. So that life is a round-the-clock exercise in being hectored about everything that's wrong about us and our way of life. And the irony of it all is hard to distill down to a few words, but I'll have a go. We have to listen to their sanctimonious, hypocritical, lying crap about climate crisis and net zero and ultra-low emission zones and 15-minute cities and digital IDs and central bank digital currencies and all the rest of their perfidious anti-human poison. While all the time, governments and corporations and the rest of those that are really in charge, the corporations are really in charge, they make nothing more than a mess everywhere they go. And for the longest time, what they've made more than anything else is war and war and war again. All across the West in particular, governments are making cuts to the budgets that are supposed to improve the lives of the people they're supposed to serve. On both sides of the Atlantic, hard-working, tax-paying, law-abiding people are being told to put up with harder, colder, more limited lives, while their governments simultaneously find hundreds of billions of dollars, pounds, euros, trillions indeed, to launder through one war after another in pursuit of nothing but wealth and power and control. Just how stupid do they think we are? Or perhaps the more pertinent, harder to face question is just how stupid have we been? And sometimes I think it's all about faith in the end. It's all about believing. 2,000 years ago, some people started believing in an up-and-coming religion called Christianity. Not to put too fine a point on it, there was something in it for the believers, namely the promise of eternal life in a blissful heaven. There was something in it for them, and so they believed. I'm not talking about God here. God is just God. What I'm talking about are things done by humans in the name of God. And religion, human-made religion, becomes just another tool to be used to exploit people, which is not what I understand that God ever intended. But I still say it's about belief. A religion, a nation, a government, even a corporation, when you get right down to it, none of those exist. Not in any absolute sense. They're just and only the creations of people. A nation exists only as long as enough people believe in it. If they stop, it's gone. Right there and then. Likewise, a corporation is just a legal fiction, as I've already mentioned. Literally a legal fiction. It's only real if people accept it's real. The lawyers can write what they want, and the corporation can proclaim whatever it likes. But if people don't believe in it, it's not really there. And people only believe in things when there's something in it for them, which is fair enough. Somewhere along the line, the governments and the corporations have forgotten that. They actually believe their own fiction now. They actually believe that they exist without us, without the belief of the people. And I say they've crossed a line. A lot of them. I would say the line is so far behind them, they're looking at it as a vanishing dot in the rearview mirror. Now, they think that they exist to tell us what to do. They think they own us. And the day is coming, and right soon, when enough people realise that when it comes to our governments and corporations and the rest, there's nothing in it for us anymore. Or less and less every day. That line about owning nothing and being happy, that's never going to fly. And when that moment comes, it's over for those demagogues and oligarchs. Ask not what your country can do for you, said JFK. Well, I say the time has well and truly and finally come when we have to tell our country what it can do. And as far as I'm concerned, our countries, in the form of the governments, and more importantly, the corporations and the banks and the NGOs that actually run our governments and countries, I say the time has come to tell them they can just do one.